The 14th interpreter pulled off his headset and walked away. Done. In a conference room worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime, 8 international delegations began packing their briefcases. Richard Langford, CEO of Meridian Global Partners, felt the blood drain from his face. Months of preparation collapsing in real time. And at the far end of the room, a black single father in a janitor's uniform was quietly wiping the glass walls, a man no one in that building had ever bothered to learn the name of. When he stepped forward and spoke fluent Mandarin, the entire room went dead silent. Now, before I tell you how this man ended up in that room and what happened next, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel, and if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Trust me, this one is worth staying for. But that moment hadn't happened yet. 12 hours before the world's most expensive silence, Daniel Reyes was sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed, holding a picture book open to a page with a rabbit wearing a tiny sombrero. Serena was 5, and she had her mother's eyes deep brown, always searching, always catching things other people missed. "Do the voice again, Daddy?" she said, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Daniel shifted into Spanish soft and melodic, giving the rabbit a voice that sounded like it belonged in a telenovela. Serena giggled. He switched to French for the fox, and then to German for the grumpy old owl, making each character sound like it came from a different world. His daughter didn't know the words, but she understood the music of them the way each language carried its own weight, its own warmth. "How many languages do you know?" Serena asked, the same question she asked every night, as if the number might change. Daniel smiled. "Enough to tell you the same story 8 different ways." She considered this with the seriousness only a 5-year-old could manage. "But which way is the real one?" He kissed her forehead. "All of them." By the time Serena's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, Daniel had already changed into his uniform. Gray shirt, gray pants, a name badge that read D. Reyes Custodial Services. He checked the lock twice, left the apartment key under the mat for Mrs. Gutierrez, the retired neighbor who stayed with Serena on the nights Daniel worked, and walked her to kindergarten every morning, and drove 23 minutes through the quiet streets of the suburbs to the glass tower where Meridian Global Partners occupied 32 floors of prime real estate. Daniel had been cleaning that building for nearly 4 years. He knew which executives left coffee rings on mahogany tables and which ones actually used coasters. He knew the cleaning crew by name, knew which hallways had security cameras with blind spots, knew the exact minute the last senior VP left on any given night. He knew the building the way only invisible people can completely, because no one ever thought to hide anything from him. What no one knew about Daniel was this: before Serena, before the night shifts, before the gray uniform, he had been a linguistics student. Not a casual one. The kind who could diagram the tonal structure of Cantonese while simultaneously writing a paper on Arabic morphology. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where 5 languages were spoken on the same block: Spanish from his mother, Portuguese from the family next door, Mandarin from the couple who ran the grocery store, Arabic from the man who fixed cars in his driveway. Languages didn't come to Daniel the way they came to most people, through classrooms and textbooks. They came the way air came naturally, constantly, from every direction. He'd earned a full scholarship. He'd been 6 months from completing his degree when Elena got sick. The scholarship didn't wait for tragedy. The university didn't care that his wife was dying and his daughter was barely a year old. Life had a way of drawing hard lines, and Daniel landed on the wrong side of every one of them. So he folded his textbooks into a box, put the box in a closet, and found a job that paid enough to keep Serena fed and the lights on. Now he pushed a cleaning cart through the halls of Meridian Global Partners, past offices where people earned in a day what he earned in a month, and he never once felt sorry for himself. That was the thing about Daniel: he didn't carry bitterness. He carried vocabulary. Every night after the floors were mopped and the trash bins emptied, he would sit in the break room and read. Not novels, not magazines, legal journals in German, financial reports in Mandarin, trade publications in Arabic. He'd pull them from the recycling bins outside the executive office's documents that had served their purpose for the people who printed them, but still had everything to teach the man who cleaned up after them. 8 languages maintained in secret, sharpened in silence, used for nothing and no one, except the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were still there. That night, the night before everything changed, Daniel was finishing the 31st floor when he noticed the main conference room had been transformed. The long oak table was gone, replaced by a massive U-shaped arrangement with nameplates in 8 different languages. Briefing packets sat at each station thick as novels. Translation equipment lined the back wall. Flags from 8 countries stood in a neat row near the entrance. Daniel didn't need to read the memo pinned to the operations board to know what this was. Meridian Global Partners was hosting the negotiation, the one the financial press had been speculating about for months. A multi-billion-dollar international infrastructure deal involving delegations from the United States, Germany, Japan, Brazil, France, Saudi Arabia, Spain, and the People's Republic of China. The kind of deal that could reshape markets, the kind that careers were built on or destroyed by. He was reading one of the Arabic briefing packets when a voice cut through the silence. Reyes. Randy Webb stood in the doorway, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Webb was the director of operations at Meridian, technically in charge of facilities logistics and the custodial staff, though he treated the last category the way most people treated furniture. Webb was not a cruel man in the obvious sense. He never raised his voice. He never used slurs. He simply operated on a belief so deeply embedded it had become invisible to him that the world functioned correctly when everyone stayed in their assigned place. Janitors cleaned. Executives decided. The line between them was not a suggestion, it was structural. "You're in the conference zone," Webb said. His tone was flat administrative. "You were supposed to finish this floor 40 minutes ago." Daniel set the packet down. "Just making sure the setup is clean for tomorrow." Webb's eyes flicked to the briefing documents, then back to Daniel. "You don't need to read the materials to clean the room, Reyes. Wipe the surfaces, vacuum the carpet, leave. And don't touch the equipment on the back wall, the AV team handles that." Daniel nodded. He'd learned a long time ago that arguing with Webb was like arguing with a wall that had been promoted to middle management. The man didn't see people, he saw positions. And Daniel's position was clear. "Reminder," Webb added as he turned to leave, "no reading documents on desks, no lingering in restricted areas after your task is complete, no interacting with any day shift personnel. I've written it up before and I'll write it up again. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Daniel said. Webb disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor with the regularity of a metronome. Daniel finished wiping the glass walls, emptied the last trash can, and pushed his cart toward the elevator. The next morning, the conference room filled with the most powerful negotiators on the planet. 8 delegations, 47 representatives, 6 interpreters on standby, with 8 more available remotely. Richard Langford, CEO of Meridian Global Partners, stood at the head of the room, and for the first time in his 30-year career, he felt the full weight of what he had built, pressing down on his chest. This deal was not just revenue, it was legacy. It was the thing he wanted to point to when his grandchildren asked what he'd done with his life. The lead interpreter, a woman named Sandra Whitfield, considered one of the best multilingual negotiators in the country, was supposed to anchor the entire session. She called in sick at 7:15 that morning. Stomach virus. Couldn't stand without the room spinning. Langford's team scrambled. Replacement interpreters were brought in one after another. The first couldn't handle the legal terminology in German. The second mangled the honorifics in Japanese so badly that the Tokyo delegation visibly stiffened. The third confused a key Arabic phrase translating, "We request clarification on the terms, as we refuse to cooperate," and the Saudi delegation stood up from their seats. By the time the 14th interpreter gave up, the room had turned from professional to hostile. Delegations were whispering among themselves. The Brazilian team was already on the phone with São Paulo. The French representative had closed his briefcase. Langford stared at the wreckage of his legacy unfolding in real time. He glanced down at his phone at the photo of his family on the lock screen and felt something he hadn't felt in decades: helplessness. And in the hallway just outside the glass walls, Daniel Reyes had stopped mopping. He could hear everything through the door that someone had left slightly open. He heard the Arabic mistranslation. He heard the Japanese honorific butchered. He heard the Mandarin phrasing twisted into something that sounded more like an insult than a proposal. He knew exactly what was going wrong. He knew exactly how to fix it. But he also knew what he was. A janitor. A black man in a gray uniform. A single father who could not afford to lose this job. If he walked in there and it went wrong, he'd be out by the end of the day. No severance, no reference, no safety net. Serena's face flashed through his mind the way she looked at him every morning when he came home from the night shift, sleepy-eyed, but always smiling, always certain that her father would be there. He gripped the handle of his mop and stared at the conference room door. Then he heard the sound of chairs pushing back briefcases, snapping shut, the unmistakable noise of a deal dying. Daniel set down the mop. He straightened his uniform, and he knocked on the door. The door opened from the inside before Daniel could knock a second time. Randy Webb stood on the other side, his face already twisted into something between disbelief and fury. Webb had been stationed in the conference room all morning, as logistics support, making sure the water pitchers were full, the translation headsets were charged, the name cards were properly aligned. Small things, the kind of things a man like Webb believed held the world together. "Reyes," Webb said, stepping into the hallway and pulling the door half shut behind him. "What the hell are you doing here?" Daniel kept his voice low. The Arabic interpreter, the third one, made a critical error. He translated a request for clarification as a refusal to cooperate. That's why the Saudi delegation nearly walked out. The Mandarin phrasing in the opening proposal is also wrong. It's framed as a demand when it should be framed as an invitation. If someone doesn't correct it, this deal is over. Webb stared at him the way a man stares at a dog that has suddenly started speaking. Not impressed, disturbed. "How would you know any of that?" "Because I speak the languages, Mr. Webb." Webb's jaw tightened. "You're a custodial worker. You clean floors. Go back to your cart. Go back to your floor and do not come near this room again. I will be filing a report." He started to close the door, but a hand caught it from behind. Richard Langford had been standing close enough to the entrance to hear the exchange. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, the look of a man who had already lost control and knew it. "Wait," Langford said. His eyes moved past Webb and landed on Daniel, on the custodial uniform, the name badge, the mop bucket visible at the end of the hallway. The CEO studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies a life raft he doesn't entirely trust. Webb turned to face his boss. "Sir, this is a custodial employee. He has no clearance, no credentials, and no business in a negotiation of this magnitude." Langford looked back into the conference room. The German delegation's lead negotiator was checking his watch. The representative from Tokyo was speaking quietly into his phone, never a good sign. The Saudi delegation leader had his arms crossed and hadn't spoken in 15 minutes. Every second was another brick falling from the wall Langford had spent months building. "You said you speak the languages," Langford said to Daniel. "Which ones?" "All 8 represented in that room, sir." Langford exhaled through his nose. He didn't believe it, not fully. But he was out of interpreters, out of time, and staring down the most expensive failure of his career. 60 seconds, Langford said. "You get 60 seconds. If you can't deliver, you walk out quietly and we never speak of this again." Webb stepped forward. "You can't be serious. You're going to let a janitor address 8 international delegations." Langford's voice dropped. "I'm going to let anyone who can save this deal address 8 international delegations, Randy. Right now, that's all I care about." He held the door open. Daniel stepped through. The conference room felt different from the inside. The glass walls that Daniel had wiped hundreds of times now reflected his janitor's clothes back at him from every angle. 47 faces turned toward him, some confused, some annoyed, a few openly contemptuous. He saw the look he'd seen his entire life, the quick calculation people made when they saw a black man in a service uniform walking into a space where he clearly didn't belong. The mental sorting: wrong room, wrong floor, wrong person. Daniel walked to the center of the U-shaped table. He did not introduce himself. He did not explain who he was. He simply turned to the Chinese delegation and began speaking Mandarin. Not the textbook Mandarin of a language student. The lived Mandarin of someone who had grown up listening to it over the counter of a neighborhood grocery store, who had spent years reading financial documents in the language, who understood that in Mandarin the difference between a proposal and a command could hinge on a single tonal shift. He addressed the lead negotiator, directly rephrasing the opening terms of the deal with the kind of deference and precision that the previous interpreters had completely missed. The negotiator, a woman in a dark navy suit who had not smiled once all morning, tilted her head slightly. Then she nodded. She spoke a sentence in reply, and Daniel translated it for the room. In flawless English, the delegation was open to continued discussion, provided the language reflected mutual respect rather than hierarchy. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not yet. But the way a ship shifts when the first rope catches the dock, something had taken hold. Daniel turned to the Saudi delegation. He switched to Arabic, not the formal modern standard Arabic that the failed interpreters had been using, but a register that balanced formality with warmth, the kind of Arabic used between business partners who respected each other. He addressed the misunderstanding directly. The phrase that had been translated as, "we refuse to cooperate," had actually meant, "we would like to better understand the specific terms before proceeding." The delegation leader uncrossed his arms. He responded in Arabic, and Daniel translated an apology was not necessary, but accuracy going forward was non-negotiable. Then German and the legal terminology that had defeated the first interpreter fell into place like a key turning in a lock. Then Portuguese untangling the financial dispute that had left the Brazilian team ready to fly home. Then Japanese, and here Daniel slowed down because Japanese was not just a language, but a system of respect, and the Tokyo delegation needed to feel that their position was honored before they would engage. He used the correct honorifics, the right level of formality, and a phrasing structure that placed the delegation's concerns at the center rather than the margins. French came next. The representative from Paris had been sitting with his briefcase closed for the better part of an hour, and Daniel addressed him with the kind of formal elegance that the language demanded, restructuring a disputed clause in a way that preserved French contractual tradition while remaining compatible with the American framework. The representative reopened his briefcase. Spanish followed, bridging the Madrid delegation back into the conversation with a fluency that carried the cadence of Daniel's mother's voice, the first language he'd ever known, the one that still lived closest to his heart. And through it all, English, clear, precise, authoritative, binding every thread into a single fabric. 14 interpreters had failed because they translated words. Daniel succeeded because he translated meaning. He understood that the German delegation needed contractual precision. He understood that the Japanese delegation needed to feel heard before they could agree. He understood that the Saudi representative's frustration was not about the deal, it was about being misrepresented. He understood that language was never just language. It was culture. It was history. It was the invisible architecture of trust. For 2 hours, Daniel stood at the center of that room, without a chair, without a title, without a name card, and he held 8 nations together with nothing but his voice. The deal didn't just survive, it accelerated. Clauses that had been stuck for weeks suddenly moved. Provisions that had seemed impossible found common ground. The lead negotiator from the Chinese delegation leaned over to her colleague and said something that made him nod with visible approval. The Saudi delegation leader, the same man who had nearly walked out an hour earlier, was now engaged in a detailed back and forth about implementation timelines through Daniel, who relayed every word with the precision of a man who understood that a misplaced syllable could collapse the entire structure again. By the time the session ended, every delegation had signed a letter of intent. Several delegates looked toward Daniel as they stood. The lead negotiator from the Chinese delegation crossed the room and said something to him in Mandarin, something brief, something private, and Daniel bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. Randy Webb watched the entire thing from his chair near the back wall. He did not clap when the delegations shook hands. He did not smile when Langford exhaled with visible relief. What Webb felt was something colder and more complicated than resentment. If a janitor could walk into a room and outperform 14 credentialed professionals, then what did credentials mean? What did the hierarchy mean? What did Webb's entire career of maintaining that hierarchy mean? The ground beneath his feet had cracked, and he was already looking for ways to seal it back up. After the delegations filed out after the handshakes and the exchanged business cards and the quiet congratulations, Daniel walked back into the hallway. His mop bucket was where he'd left it. The water had gone cold. He picked up the mop and started working on the section of floor he'd missed. Webb found him 12 minutes later on his knees, wiping a baseboard near the elevator bank. Reyes. Webb's voice was controlled precise. What you did in there, regardless of the outcome, was a violation of Section 4, Subsection 12 of the Custodial Employee Handbook. Unauthorized presence in a restricted area during a classified corporate event. Unauthorized interaction with external stakeholders. I'm documenting it. It will go in your file. Daniel didn't look up. Understood, Mr. Webb? Webb lingered for a moment as if expecting an argument. When none came, he walked away. 20 minutes later, a different voice called Daniel's name. Richard Langford was standing at the end of the hallway, jacket off, hands in his pockets. He looked like a man who had just survived something he hadn't expected to survive. "Walk with me," Langford said. They walked in silence to Langford's office on the 32nd floor. It was the kind of office that made statements floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk the size of a small car, shelves lined with awards, and framed handshakes with politicians. Langford sat on the edge of his desk instead of behind it. He studied Daniel standing in the doorway, still in the same clothes he'd been mopping floors in an hour ago, still wearing the name badge that said, D. Reyes Custodial Services. "I'm not going to thank you," Langford said. "Not yet. First, I need to understand something. A man who speaks 8 languages fluently, who just orchestrated a negotiation that my best people couldn't handle, is working the night shift mopping my floors. I need to know why." Daniel stood still for a long time. He'd carried this story silently for years, told it to no one because no one had ever asked. Not his co-workers, not his supervisors. Not a single person in this building had ever looked at the man holding the mop and wondered what he might be holding inside. "I was a linguistics student," Daniel said. "Full ride, 6 months from finishing my degree. Then my wife got sick. Not the kind of sick that gets better, the kind that takes everything. The scholarship had conditions. I missed too many classes, missed too many deadlines. They pulled it. I couldn't afford to continue without it, so I stopped." He looked at the floor, the same floor he'd cleaned 1,000 times. "She died when my daughter was 2. I needed a job that would let me work nights so I could be home during the day for her. Custodial work at a building that operates around the clock, that was what was available. So that's what I took." He didn't say it with self-pity. He said it the way a man describes the weather, as something that happened, something he moved through, something that didn't require anyone's sympathy to be true. "The languages," Daniel continued, "I never let them go. Every night after my shift, after Serena falls asleep, I study. I read whatever I can find, the journals and reports your executives throw away, trade publications, legal briefs. 4 years of that. The languages aren't rusty, Mr. Langford. They're the sharpest thing about me. They're just the thing nobody ever thought to look for." Langford was quiet for a long time. He was thinking about something he hadn't thought about in decades about himself at 25, fresh out of business school, walking into his first corporate job with a firm handshake and a family name that opened doors before he ever had to knock. He'd earned what he'd built. He believed that sincerely. But the distance between his starting line and Daniel's was not something you could measure in miles. It was measured in assumptions, in the 1,000 small decisions that a society makes about who gets seen and who gets overlooked. Standing here looking at Daniel Reyes, Langford couldn't avoid the question that had been forming since the moment Daniel opened his mouth in Mandarin. How many people like this had he walked past? How many were cleaning floors and stocking shelves and driving trucks carrying entire worlds inside them that no one ever thought to look for? And how many of those people had knocked on doors that no one bothered to open? It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something worse, the realization that the system he trusted to identify talent had a blind spot the size of a building and he'd never noticed because the blind spot had never cost him anything. Until today. Langford opened his mouth to speak, but the office door swung open before he could form the words. Randy Webb stood in the doorway holding a printed document, a formal incident report already filled out, requiring the CEO's signature. "Sir," Webb said, placing the paper on Langford's desk. "The disciplinary write-up for Reyes. Section 4, subsection 12. I need your authorization to proceed." Langford looked at the document. Then he looked at Daniel. Then he looked at Webb. The room held 3 men, 3 truths, and 1 piece of paper that would determine which truth mattered most. Langford picked up the incident report. He read it slowly, every line, every checkbox, every reference to Section 4, subsection 12. Webb had filled it out with the meticulous precision of a man who believed that paperwork was the skeleton of civilization. Every blank completed, every violation catalogued, a perfect document. Langford tore it in half. The sound of the paper ripping was the loudest thing in the room. Webb's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes shifted the look of a man watching a foundation crack. That man, Langford said, nodding toward Daniel, just saved a deal worth more than this building, and you want me to write him up for being in the wrong hallway. Webb straightened his shoulders. "With respect, sir, what I want is irrelevant. What matters is the precedent. If you let a custodial employee bypass every protocol we have, walk into a classified negotiation without clearance, without credentials, without authorization, and you reward him for it, then you're telling every employee in this company that the rules don't apply if the outcome is good enough. That's not how systems work. That's how systems collapse." It was, Langford had to admit, not a stupid argument. Webb wasn't ranting. He wasn't being petty. He was making the case that any operations director in any corporation in the country would make. Rules existed for reasons. Hierarchies existed for reasons. You couldn't run a 32-floor multinational on exceptions. But Langford kept looking at Daniel, at the name badge, at the man who had stood in a room full of the most powerful negotiators on the planet and held them together with nothing but his voice and his knowledge, and he knew that Webb's argument, however logical, was built on a floor that had already given way. Randy, Langford said, "Our system just failed in front of 8 countries. 14 credentialed interpreters couldn't do what this man did in 60 seconds. If the system can't recognize that kind of talent when it's been standing in our building for 4 years, then the system isn't working. It's just running." Webb said nothing. His jaw tightened, and he folded his hands behind his back, the posture of a soldier who disagreed with the order but would not say so out loud. Langford turned to Daniel. "I want to offer you a position. International Communications Specialist. You'd work directly with our Global Partnerships Division. Salary benefits office on this floor. You'd never touch a mop in this building again." The words hung in the air like something fragile. Daniel had imagined a version of this moment in the quiet hours of his night shifts. Not this specific offer, but the general shape of it. Someone seeing him. Someone saying, "You belong somewhere else." He had imagined it so many times that he'd stopped believing it would happen. And now that it was happening standing in the CEO's office in his custodial uniform, with the torn incident report on the floor between them, Daniel felt something he didn't expect. "Doubt, Mr. Langford," Daniel said, and his voice was steady but careful, the way a man speaks when he's about to say something that might cost him everything for the second time in one day. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you offering me this position because you actually need what I can do, or because you feel guilty about what you just learned?" Langford opened his mouth, but Daniel kept going. "Because I've seen how this works. A company has a moment of clarity. They make a gesture. They create a title that sounds important. And 6 months later, the person sitting in that title is at a desk Nobody visits doing work. Nobody assigned, waiting for the day they get quietly let go so the company can go back to the way things were. If that's what this is, if this is just a way for you to feel better about yourself, then I'd rather go back to my mop. At least the mop is honest about what it is. The office went silent. Webb, still standing near the door, watched with an expression that was impossible to read. Not quite satisfaction, not quite respect, but something in the territory between. Langford didn't answer immediately. He walked around his desk, sat down in his chair for the first time since they'd entered the room, and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city stretched below. Somewhere down there, Daniel's daughter was sitting in a kindergarten classroom, drawing pictures with crayons and waiting for her father to pick her up the way he always did, and Daniel was supposed to be mopping floors, and the world was supposed to keep turning the way it always had. "You're right," Langford said finally. "If I just hand you a title and move on, nothing changes. You'd be a story I tell at dinner parties, the janitor who saved the deal. A feel-good anecdote. And a year from now, someone like you would still be invisible in this building." He turned his chair to face Daniel. "So here's what I'm going to do. I'm calling an executive review of our entire talent identification process, not just salaried employees, but every person who works in this building. Contract workers, custodial staff, security, maintenance, every single one. Because if I missed you for 4 years, I have to assume I'm missing others. And I'm not comfortable with that assumption anymore." He stood. "The position is real, the salary is real, and the review will happen whether you accept or not, because the problem isn't about you, Daniel. The problem is about us." Daniel looked at Langford for a long time, the kind of look that searches for the seam between what a man says and what a man means. He had spent his whole life reading people across languages, across cultures, across the invisible walls that humans build between each other. He could tell when someone was performing sincerity and when someone was living it. Langford was not performing. "I'll take the position," Daniel said, "but I have one condition. The next time someone in a gray uniform has something to say, your door stays open. Not because of what happened today, because it should have been open all along." Langford nodded. "Agreed." Webb cleared his throat from the doorway. "I'll process the transfer paperwork," he said. His voice was neutral, not warm, not hostile. Administrative. Webb would comply with the decision because the decision had been made by the man who signed his paychecks. But compliance was not the same as belief, and everyone in that room understood the difference. Webb would continue to run his department with the same rigid precision he always had. He would continue to believe in the hierarchy, in the rules, in the lines that separated one kind of worker from another. The world didn't change because one man crossed a line. It changed when the line itself was redrawn, and that the redrawing would take longer than a single afternoon. 3 weeks later, Daniel Reyes walked into the Meridian Global Partners building through the main entrance. Not the service door in the back. Not the loading dock. The glass front doors that faced the street where executives and clients and board members entered every morning. He wore a navy suit, the first he'd owned since his wedding, and a name badge that read, Daniel Reyes International Communications Specialist. The security guard at the front desk, a man named Eddie, who had nodded at Daniel 1,000 times without ever making eye contact, looked up and didn't recognize him at first. Then he did. His eyebrows rose. Daniel nodded at him the same way he always had because the suit was new, but the man inside it was the same. On the 31st floor, the conference room where everything had changed was being prepared for a follow-up session with 3 of the original delegations. Daniel walked in through the main door. The lead negotiator from the Chinese delegation saw him from across the table. She stood across the room and shook his hand the way you greet a colleague, not a curiosity. The Saudi delegation leader followed. Then the representative from Tokyo, who offered a slight bow that Daniel returned with the exact degree of formality the gesture required. They remembered him. Not as the janitor who had surprised them, as the man who had understood them. Many years later, on a warm afternoon in June, Daniel sat in the 3rd row of a university auditorium and watched his daughter walk across a stage. Serena Reyes, 22 years old, magna cum laude double major in linguistics and international relations. She had her mother's eyes. She still caught things other people missed. When it was her turn to speak a short address selected by the graduating class, Serena stood at the podium and looked out at the audience. She found her father in the third row. He was wearing the same navy suit. It still fit. "My father taught me 8 languages before I turned 10, Serena said. "But the most important thing he ever taught me had nothing to do with words. He taught me that knowing how to speak isn't the same as knowing when to speak. And he taught me that the people the world refuses to listen to are usually the ones with the most to say." Daniel sat very still. He thought about a night a long time ago, a cold mop bucket, a door he almost didn't knock on a 60-second window that changed the rest of his life. He thought about Elena, about the scholarship that vanished, about the box of textbooks still sitting in the back of his closet because he could never bring himself to throw them away. He thought about the fact that 14 interpreters had failed that day, not because they lacked skill, but because they only heard the words. They translated language the way a machine translates language: input, output, move on. They never stopped to ask what the person on the other side of the table actually meant. They never considered that a phrase in Arabic might carry grief, or that a sentence in Japanese might carry pride, or that a proposal in Mandarin might carry an entire nation's hope for how it wanted to be seen by the world. Daniel had understood all of it, not because he was smarter, not because he was better trained, but because he had spent his entire life being misunderstood, being looked at and never seen, being heard and never listened to, and that had taught him something no classroom could teach, and no degree could certify: that the most important thing about language is not the words. It's the human being behind them. 14 interpreters heard language. Daniel heard people, and that made all the difference. If this story moved you think about who in your life might be invisible, carrying something extraordinary that no one has ever stopped to notice. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're not subscribed yet, come join us. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. I'll see you in the next one.